and we're blatantly not doing the same thing. I have seen few things as powerful as for getting buy-in about integrity and accountability and not falling victim to becoming a bitter cynic than for administrators to do just that. And then secondly, after doing that, whatever the answers are, engage employees. In other words, so maybe you and the other administrators, you've listed three things that are obvious ethical problems that you've been putting off. Bad morale as an example. Take bad morale, do a legitimate needs assessment to find out what are the specific causes for anger and frustration among employees, and then ask for volunteers to investigate that further and find out what the causes are perceived to be, what obvious viable solutions can be to addressing and improving the anger and frustration among employees. So engage employees, because now you have a situation where most employees, the 800,000 or so all across the nation, most of them believe that the departments are blatantly hypocritical in how they're run. But secondly, the really hurtful cynics who spew the turmoil and create the us versus them phenomenon and so forth, they're going to be counteracted. Because you can prove, and actions speak louder than words, you're proving that you are role modeling what you're asking others to do. After that's done, the path to this is pretty simple. Then to continue on about making sure that you're not forgetting things, ask yourself a series of questions. Ask yourself things like, is discipline really understood? Is progressive discipline being followed? Have there ever been training, good legitimate training internal-wise, where there's interaction in the class and people can speak their mind about things that they think that are unfair in the discipline process? Or the policies updated on a regular basis? Or are some things archaic and almost laughable because they were written decades ago and don't apply now at all? Ask yourself those really probing questions that relate to integrity and discipline and accountability when you're doing that needs assessment and you're determining what obvious ethical problems and flaws that need to be addressed. Once that's done, then you can make sure that your policies are in place and being followed, that employees truly do understand what's going on. Next, track integrity indicators of personnel. You can do this by unit, squad, or division, and you can also do it, almost cross-reference it by employee. And by integrity indicators, I mean things that are associated with integrity or misconduct, like citizen complaints, but citizen attaboy letters and the good phone calls that come in. Use of sick time, because overtime abuse is one of the main violators of misconduct, and in many cases send officers to prison because they're falsifying records and it's a form of embezzlement. Performance evaluations. All these different things that can be tracked per unit and also tracked per employee. It's almost like an early warning system that you're doing that can also be tracked not only for employees but for leaders. And for leaders, you can track such things as the number of requests to and from a particular leader, because it's very telling that if you have one supervisor and you're tracking the requests to and from supervisors, and you have one or two supervisors that you have an unusually high number of requests to go away from a particular supervisor, that it's an indicator there's probably a reason why no one wants to work for that person. And on the other hand, you could have one or two supervisors where they are always the ones that people request that they want to work towards. And more things that you can track. Statistically, you can track integrity indicators about a supervisor's employees. And it's right on target for what you want to achieve. Self-accountability. You can track the confirmed violations of policy and so forth. So the whole topic of self-accountability no longer has to be subjective and fuzzy and so forth. It can be very objective and statistically driven, so that it's fair from a leadership standpoint about maintaining integrity and self-accountability, because you have the numbers. It's not the good old boy system anymore. It's not a form of cronyism. You have the specific numbers you can turn to as indicators about whether or not employees are actually holding themselves accountable. Of course, the first step, like we talked about before, was for leaders to do that same thing. And in my view, if it's not begun in that way, where administrators role model the self-accountability that they're going to ask employees to do, then there's no point in doing that. Because if that isn't done first, the perception, and it's widespread typically, is what a bunch of hypocrisy. How hypocritical can we be that they're asking us to hold ourselves accountable, when I can look up at the chain of command and I can find this mid-level manager having sex with officer or agent so-and-so, and they're married to other people. When I can look up the chain of command and we have this problem of this mid-level manager or administrator demeaning and ridiculing people on a regular basis, and then they want us to hold ourselves accountable for the integrity when so blatantly they're doing just the opposite. It's better not to start this project at all than to be a hypocrite, because then people lose respect for integrity and can rationalize even more misconduct. But done right, that's a very powerful thing to do. I've seldom seen anything that gets buy-in and support for a movement of integrity than for administrators to acknowledge that they have been doing things perhaps not the way they should have been, meaning they've been ignoring things they shouldn't have been ignoring. And lastly, of the steps for self-accountability, the last step would be to do things that help to lend themselves to maintaining a culture of integrity. It's one thing to get buy-in. It's something else to get people engaged and feel as though that they want to hold themselves accountable. But this can just be a flash in the pan. It can be almost fad-like if it's not maintained. And there are several ways of doing that. One of the keys is to have special attention paid to line supervisors, because they're almost like the gatekeepers. They know when there's integrity-related problems way, way ahead of mid-level managers or administrators. The question is whether or not they're going to do anything about it or simply look the other way. Another great strategy that's got to become part of the culture is looking for opportunities to give recognition and praise. In most law enforcement agencies, we're really good at giving discipline, negative consequences to behavior, but we're really bad at ignoring recognition and praise, whether it's the simple pat on the back, or it's including the need and the value of that in line supervision training internally, or setting up systems with newsletters where you can give praise, impromptu certificates and awards that are unexpected, or formal ceremonies at the end of the year. All those things are crucial, and research shows that positive reinforcement, recognition and praise in terms of altering, changing, promoting behavior that's desired simply lasts a lot longer than negative consequences. And lastly, in terms of maintaining a culture that sustains integrity, take an honest look at the frequency and quality of your internal training related to ethics. Most people retire, and after they've gone through the academy, even though you can look on walls and hallways and there'll be the code of ethics and so forth, the truth is most organizations have done very little training, very little emphasis, and the message, beyond the fact that we're not giving people the skills and the abilities to overcome the toughest moments, ethical dilemmas in their career, the message we're sending by not doing that type of training is that it's not important. Exactly the opposite message that we need to be sending as administrators. Actions really do say so much more than words. And the fact that we're supportive as administrators for regular training about integrity says everything. The fact that it's never done says everything, but it's the wrong message. Hi, I'm Neil Troutman, and I want to talk about the Code of Silence. First off, before we get to some research that's finally been done, let me say a few words about the significance, the value, the importance of the Code of Silence. The first thing we need to acknowledge is that it exists, and it's virtually everywhere. The only time you can have a law enforcement agency and what we call the Code of Silence not be alive and well is if it's a tiny law enforcement agency, 2, 3, 4 people, and they all hate each other. In other words, it exists because it's a natural phenomenon. It's the phenomenon of emotional bonding. It is totally natural when people spend a lot of time together that they build a strong bond. The problem with the Code of Silence in law enforcement and other professions is that that bond of loyalty, peer pressure, becomes more important to people than the bond and loyalty to honor and integrity. The significance of the Code of Silence is this. If we can learn how to mold a culture to where the culture of work units inside a law enforcement agency and the entire workforce of an organization, the culture is driven by honor and integrity to the extent that that's a higher priority than peer pressure, than loyalty to another person, then to a great degree, we can stop systemic corruption, because the way systemic corruption happens is that it begins with one person, sometimes a couple, but more often than not, one person doing something relatively small. There are exceptions, but they are exceptions and not the norm. And then that one person manipulates, persuades, gets the buy-in of other people to simply look the other way, of do nothing while that person does the misconduct, or they join in. And like a cancer, the misconduct grows. And then you have several people doing the same thing. And then you can have eventually a whole group, a squad or a unit, buying into doing whatever the misconduct is. If loyalty to honor and integrity was really the highest priority, then it wouldn't be so rare for misconduct to be exposed from employees inside the organization. Does that happen? Yes, but it's not the norm. The norm is somebody gets caught or somebody on the outside exposes it, so forth and so on. We could stop to a substantial degree systemic corruption if, in fact, we can counteract the Code of Silence, and if we can build and mold cultures where loyalty to honor and integrity is the highest priority. Then if someone's working with a fellow employee and they're starting to commit misconduct and trying to persuade others to do the same thing, they're not going to look the other way. They're going to confront the person, perhaps informally, perhaps officially. But the bottom line is they're not going to let that person get the buy-in of others to destroy their career. They're going to stop them. And that's the key, and that's the importance. And the good news about this subject was, in past years, in past decades, it was just kind of fuzzy. It was subjective. Did it exist or did it not exist? Well, now there's been research. In 1999 and the year 2000, the National Institute of Ethics did research on the Code of Silence. They asked 2,657 officers all across the nation a question, an extensive confidential survey, in dozens of locations. And they asked them to complete the confidential survey. Out of the 2,657, 1,116 did. They took the survey. Out of the 1,116, 532 said that during their career, they had participated in the Code of Silence. And more specifically, they witnessed firsthand officers committing misconduct and chose to do nothing. In some cases, they did more than that. They lied to internal affairs during an investigation, or they falsified a report to cover up the misconduct. But the overwhelming common pattern that they all did was they did nothing to prevent the misconduct or to stop it when it was happening. 532 out of 1,116 comes out to 42%. So we studied them in great detail, not only with an extensive confidential survey, but with dozens and dozens of private interviews. And the facts I'm now going to talk about come from that study. To the best that I know, it's the only insight that we have in the Code of Silence. And we have a lot to be proud of in that sense, because it's not like in other professions and occupations it doesn't exist. It does. But law enforcement's the only one that I know of that has taken such a decisive step to identify the causes and viable solutions. So we have a lot to be proud of, especially compared to other professions. So here's research from those 532 people. In round numbers, it wasn't exactly half, but just for the purpose of our conversation, generally half of that number said that the reason why they did what they did was merely the thought of the consequences of not doing it, of the consequences they would have to bear if they stopped the person, if they reported the person. Just merely the thought of being ostracized was all it took. Peer pressure doesn't go away because we're 35 or 45 compared to 5 years old on the schoolyard and being so concerned about fitting in. Peer pressure doesn't go away with age. It's just as powerful. The primary reason, the number one given reason by those 532 people about why they did what they did was just the thought of being the outcast, just the thought of being ostracized, and that was all that it took. Now, the other group, the other half said, no, it wasn't just the thought of being the outcast and being ostracized. It was worse than that. I was pressured, I was intimidated. They gave specific reasons. I walked out to my car and my tires were flat. A brick came flying through my window. Tied to the brick was a rat. Threatening phone calls while I'm on midnight shift, sometimes directed at me on my days off. Sometimes my spouse gets the threatening phone call. Sometimes walked back from the parking lot into the locker room area and shoved down or shoved against the corner and told what to write as they show me the report that's been ripped up because I didn't go along with everybody else. Of all the findings in that study, the one I find most challenging, most important, and most disheartening is this. Of that group, and it turned out to be 270 cases where the officer was threatened, intimidated, pressured, so forth and so on. 73% of those cases, the person doing the primary threatening, intimidating, applying the pressure, it was a leader. It was a formal leader. And would you like to take a guess at what level of leadership, starting with line supervisors, the vast majority of those hundreds of cases were? It was line supervisors. And many of those interviews, I mentioned we did dozens of interviews, many of those interviews, and I was the one conducting the interviews, the person who consented, the last question on the confidential survey was, would you agree to be interviewed in private, in confidence, about what happened to you, what you did, and the causes and the reasons and so forth and so on? So many times I'm talking to the person that we're now referring to. Then the 73% of the times it was a former leader, the vast majority line supervisors. And the common pattern of those interviews was rationalizing it. And the common pattern was, look, I had no choice. I had to do what I did. I had to pressure him. I threatened him, but I had to because. And then they try to convince me, you don't understand. The department is so unfair. The promotion's so unfair.